They called her Grandma behind her back. Dr. Preston Sterling, Chief of Surgery at Metropolitan Trauma Center, actually placed a $500 bet that Sarah Miller would not last the month. He made the bet loudly, in the middle of the nurses' station, his voice echoing off the sterile linoleum floors with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no. He called her a charity case, a relic from a bygone era of medicine, hired out of some misguided sense of pity by human resources. The security camera footage from that Friday night in cold, drizzling Chicago would later capture the exact moment the world tilted on its axis. 1 second it was Dr. Sterling, sneering as he handed Sarah a box, her termination papers nestled on top of 2 decades of her life. The next, the very air in the emergency room seemed to compress, the glass of the automatic doors vibrating from a sound that was not of the city. It was a low, guttural thrumming, a rhythmic thwop, 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 that grew from a whisper to a roar that shook the foundations of the building. "Look at his neck!" Sarah had screamed, just moments before her world fell apart, her voice raw with an authority no one had ever heard from her. "You are finished!" Sterling had shrieked back, his handsome face contorted with rage. She thought her life was over. She was wrong. Her life, the one she had tried so desperately to bury under oversized scrubs and a quiet demeanor, was just beginning. And it was about to end Dr. Preston Sterling's. Section. For 3 weeks, Sarah Miller had been a ghost haunting the halls of Metropolitan's Level 1 Trauma Center. She moved with a deliberate, plotting pace that drove the younger residents insane. Her hands, when she held a chart or a pen, possessed a faint, rhythmic tremor, a subtle vibration that Dr. Sterling loved to point out. "Nerve damage," she had said quietly during her initial interview, not offering any more detail. The administrator, Harold Pemberton, had waved it off. Her resume was, on paper, impeccable. 20 years of trauma nursing experience, certifications up to the ceiling. But in person she seemed old. Not just in her early 50s, but old in a way that felt weary, worn down to the bone. Her graying blonde hair was always pulled back in a severe, unfashionable bun. Her scrubs were always a size too big, hiding a small, tired frame that looked like a strong Chicago wind could knock it over. She was the antithesis of everything Dr. Preston Sterling represented. He was the hospital's golden boy, the son of a powerful Illinois senator, a man whose jawline belonged on a movie poster and whose ego took up more space than the new MRI machine his family had donated. He wore his pristine white coat like a cape, and his stethoscope like a piece of expensive jewelry. He was Harvard Medical School, top of his class, the youngest chief of surgery in the hospital's history. And he despised Sarah Miller from the moment he saw her. She represented a flaw in his perfect, polished world. She was a reminder of age, of fallibility, of a kind of quiet competence that couldn't be bought or inherited. So he made it his mission to break her. "Sarah, could you restock the saline bags in Trauma Bay 3? He would say during a lull, his voice dripping with condescension. It was a task for an orderly, not a senior trauma nurse. But Sarah would just nod, her face unreadable. "Of course, doctor." "And after that," he would add, checking his gold Rolex, "why don't you double-check the expiration dates on all the crash cart medications? We can't have our patients dying because Grandma forgot how to read a label." A few of the younger nurses, like Brittany Moore, would giggle nervously, desperate to stay in the golden boy's good graces. The older ones, like Brenda O'Brien, the charge nurse with arms like a dock worker and a scowl permanently etched on her face, would just purse their lips and turn away. Brenda had seen a dozen doctors like Sterling come and go, hotshots who thought they were gods, only to be humbled by the relentless, messy reality of trauma. Still, even Brenda was skeptical of Sarah. The woman was too quiet, too slow. The tremor in her hands was unsettling in a profession that demanded absolute steadiness. "Miller, you checked the blood type on that unit twice," Brenda barked one afternoon. "We moving in geological time here?" "Sorry, Brenda," Sarah had replied, her voice a low rasp. "Just being thorough." She never fought back. She never raised her voice. She just absorbed the mockery, the demeaning tasks, the public humiliations, and continued her work with an obsessive attention to detail that everyone mistook for incompetence. She would stand by a patient's bedside for hours, tracking minute changes in their vitals that the monitors had not even registered yet. She saw things others missed: subtle shifts in skin pallor, the faint scent of acetone on a diabetic's breath, the almost imperceptible start of jugular vein distension. But when she would bring these concerns to Dr. Sterling, he would dismiss them with a wave of his hand. "Thank you for your observations, nurse," he would say, emphasizing the last word as if it were an insult. "But I think my Harvard education and board certification give me a slightly better grasp of the situation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual medicine to practice." He would then turn to a resident, like the perpetually nervous David Cole, and explain the case in loud, verbose terms, using jargon designed to intimidate and exclude her. Sarah would simply retreat, her face a stoic mask, and make a note in the chart. A note that, more often than not, would prove to be prescient hours later, when the patient inevitably crashed in the exact way she had predicted. Sterling would then sweep in, save the day with a procedure he should have performed earlier, and accept the accolades, never once acknowledging the quiet nurse who had seen it coming all along. The injustice was a low-grade fever in the trauma unit, a constant, simmering source of tension. The staff saw it, but Sterling's power, backed by his father's influence and the hospital board's adoration, was absolute. To cross him was to commit career suicide. So they watched, and they stayed silent. If you're already hooked by this story of justice, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really helps us share more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to back down. Now, back to Sarah Miller's story, because what happened next changed everything. The night it all ended began like any other Friday. The cold October drizzle slicked the streets of Chicago, and the emergency room hummed with the usual litany of weekend chaos. Alcohol poisonings, a domestic dispute, a fender bender from Lakeshore Drive. Dr. Sterling was holding court at the central desk, regaling a captivated Brittany Moore with a story about his recent yachting trip in the Mediterranean. Sarah was in the corner, methodically cleaning and organizing a suture kit, her movements slow and precise. Sterling caught her eye and smirked. "Sarah, a moment," he called out, his voice sharp. She walked over, her worn sneakers silent on the polished floor. "I've been reviewing your performance metrics," he said, tapping a stylus on a tablet. He did not ask her to sit. "Frankly, they're abysmal. Your response times are the slowest on the floor. You spend an inordinate amount of time on charting, and you seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the chain of command." He was projecting, ensuring every nurse, doctor, and patient within earshot could hear. It was a power play, a public execution of her dignity. "I'm just thorough, doctor," she said, her voice even. "What you call thorough, I call inefficient," he snapped. "This is a top-tier trauma center, not a geriatric nursing home. We require speed, precision, and confidence. Qualities you seem to lack." He let the insult hang in the air. Sarah just stood there, her hands clasped behind her back, a posture she adopted to hide the tremor. Before Sterling could continue his tirade, the world dissolved into noise. The overhead alarm did not just ring, it screamed. A piercing, continuous klaxon that cut through the normal din of the emergency room. Code black. Brenda O'Brien was on her feet instantly, her face grim. "What is it?" she yelled into the intercom. The voice that came back was tight with panic. "Military convoy, inbound. ETA 2 minutes.
Multiple gunshot wounds. Critical.
The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The casual Friday night vibe evaporated, replaced by a current of high-stakes adrenaline. This was not a drill. "Trauma Bay 1, now!" Sterling barked, his bravado kicking into overdrive. "Let's show them what real medicine looks like." He strode towards the bay, the residents and younger nurses scrambling in his wake like pilot fish. Sarah was already there. She had not run. She had simply moved with an economy of motion that was terrifyingly efficient, grabbing chest tubes, a 14-gauge needle, and an intubation kit before anyone else had even processed the announcement. The ambulance bay doors burst open with a deafening crash. It was not an ambulance. It was a black, up-armored Suburban, flanked by 2 military police Humvees that screeched to a halt, blocking the entrance. Soldiers in full combat gear leaped out, forming a perimeter, their rifles held at a low ready. The back doors of the Suburban flew open, and paramedics swarmed out, screaming vitals. "Male, late 30s, multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. BP is 60 over palp, heart rate 140 and thready. He's circling the drain." They wheeled the gurney in, a hurricane of controlled chaos. The man on the gurney was a mountain of muscle, even in his wounded state. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his jaw clenched in agony. Blood soaked through the field dressings on his chest. A deep, ugly gash on his neck oozed dark venous blood. "I want him typed and crossed for 10 units O-neg, now!" Sterling commanded, slipping on a pair of gloves with a dramatic snap. "Let's get a chest x-ray and get him upstairs to the OR. Cole, get pressure on that neck wound. Brittany, start 2 large-bore IVs." He was in his element, the confident commander directing his troops. But Sarah saw what he did not. While Sterling and his team focused on the dramatic, gushing wound on the man's neck, Sarah's eyes were locked on his chest and the subtle, terrifying signs everyone else was missing. The patient's neck veins were distended, bulging like thick cords. His trachea, the windpipe in his throat, was not in the center. It was shifted almost 3 centimeters to the left. When she placed her hand on his chest, she could feel a crackling sensation under the skin, like Rice Krispies. Subcutaneous emphysema. Air was leaking into his tissue. She grabbed a stethoscope, ignoring Sterling's glare, and listened to the man's chest. Breath sounds on the left side were clear. On the right, there was nothing. Silence. "He has a tension pneumothorax," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "His lung has collapsed, and it's pushing his heart and trachea to the other side. He's going to arrest." Sterling shot her a look of pure venom. "Nurse Miller, your diagnosis is not required," he hissed. "The primary bleed is from the shrapnel in his neck. Protocol dictates we control active hemorrhaging first. Now step back and let the doctors work." "There's no time for the OR," Sarah insisted, her voice rising. "That collapsed lung is crushing his heart. He's dying right now. Look at his neck." The patient's eyes rolled back in his head. The monitor above him began to shriek a new, more desperate alarm as his oxygen saturation plummeted. 80%. 75. His lips were turning a dusky shade of blue. "We're losing him," Brittany cried out, her voice trembling. Sterling froze. Just for a second, but it was enough. The confident facade cracked, and behind it was a man who knew his textbook protocols, but had no idea what to do when the patient refused to follow them. He was paralyzed by indecision, his arrogance warring with the undeniable reality of the dying man on his table. Sarah did not wait for permission. She did not ask again. Her career, her pension, the last 20 years of her quiet life, it all burned away in that instant, consumed by an oath she had taken in a dusty, war-torn country half a world away. The patient comes first. Always. She moved with a fluid precision that was breathtaking. The slow, shuffling grandma was gone. In her place was something else, something cold and lethal. She snatched the 14-gauge needle from the tray. It was long, thick, and intimidating. "Don't you dare!" Sterling bellowed, lunging for her. Sarah did not even look at him. As he reached for her, she dipped her left shoulder and pivoted, blocking his advance with a rigid elbow to his sternum. It was not a push, it was a tactical block, delivered with a kind of brutal efficiency that sent the 6'2" chief of surgery stumbling backward, gasping for air. The room went deathly silent, save for the frantic beeping of the monitor. Everyone stared, stunned. Brenda's jaw was on the floor. Brittany's hands flew to her mouth. In that moment, Sarah Miller was no longer a nurse. She was a force of nature. She placed her left hand on the patient's chest, her fingers expertly finding the landmark. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. It was a motion she had performed 1,000 times in the back of Blackhawks, in the dust of Kandahar, under the relentless sun of Fallujah, with bullets cracking overhead. The tremor in her hands was gone. They were as steady as granite. She plunged the long needle deep into the man's chest, through skin and muscle, between his ribs. There was a soft pop as the needle pierced the pleural cavity. Immediately, a loud hiss filled the room. It was the sound of trapped air, pressurized and deadly, escaping from the man's chest cavity. The effect was instantaneous and miraculous. The distended veins in the man's neck flattened. His trachea visibly shifted back to the midline. He took a huge, gasping breath, the first real breath he had taken in minutes. On the monitor, the oxygen saturation numbers began to climb. 70, 85, 98. The frantic alarm slowed to a steady, rhythmic beep. The dusky blue of his lips faded back to a healthy pink. Sarah pulled the needle out, leaving the plastic catheter in place, and taped it down. She stepped back from the table, her face beaded with sweat, her chest heaving. The patient, his eyes now open and lucid, turned his head slowly. He ignored the stunned doctors, the wide-eyed nurses, the heavily armed soldiers standing by the door. His gaze found Sarah. He was weak, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a dawning recognition. He raised a shaky hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture so profound and out of place in the sterile trauma bay that it sucked all the remaining air out of the room. It was a slow, formal salute. His lips moved, and a single, raspy word escaped through the oxygen mask. Dusty. The name hung in the air, an impossible artifact from another world. Sarah met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "At ease, Commander," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let us work." Sterling stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What? What the hell just happened?" he sputtered. Sarah turned to him, her eyes as cold and grey as the Chicago sky. "I saved your patient," she said, her voice flat. "Now do your job, Doctor." Section incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling, because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. Section. The rest of the resuscitation was a blur. With the immediate threat to the commander's life neutralized, Sterling and his team took over, their movements now hesitant and uncertain. They were working in Sarah's shadow, and they knew it. She had not just saved a patient. She had shattered the established hierarchy of the emergency room in a single decisive act. The awe in the room was palpable. The young resident, David Cole, kept glancing at her as if she had grown a second head. Brittany Moore avoided eye contact altogether, her face flushed with a mixture of shame and admiration. Even Brenda O'Brien looked at Sarah with a newfound, grudging respect. The soldiers at the door had relaxed their posture, their eyes now following the small, unassuming nurse with an intensity usually reserved for a high-value target. Once the commander was stabilized and on his way to the operating room, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the cold, hard reality of what had just transpired. Sterling, his face pale with fury, cornered Sarah by the supply closet. "You are finished," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You assaulted a physician. You performed an unauthorized procedure. I will see to it that you not only lose your job, but your nursing license as well. You will never work in this city again." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. The quiet, deferential woman was gone for good. "The patient is stable, isn't he?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "That's irrelevant," Sterling shot back. "You broke every protocol in the book." "Your protocol was killing him," she replied. Before he could respond, Harold Pemberton, the hospital administrator, scurried over, his forehead gleaming with sweat. "Dr. Sterling, Nurse Miller, my office. Now." The administrative conference room was cold and sterile, all mahogany and plush leather chairs that smelled of money and fear. Sarah sat alone on one side of the massive table. On the other side sat Pemberton, a cold-faced HR director, and Dr. Sterling, who had already composed himself into the picture of a wronged professional victim. "Nurse Miller," Pemberton began, wringing his hands, "we have a very serious situation here. Dr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint. He alleges that you physically assaulted him and performed a dangerous, unsanctioned procedure on a very high-profile patient." The HR director read the charges in a monotone voice. Gross misconduct, insubordination, reckless endangerment. Sarah listened, her expression unreadable. When the woman was finished, Sarah looked at Pemberton. "I did what was necessary to save his life," she stated simply. Dr. Sterling was hesitating. Sterling slammed his hand on the table. "That is a lie. I was following established ATLS protocol to control the primary bleed. Her reckless intervention could have punctured his heart. She was acting erratically, unstable. Frankly, I was worried for my own safety and the safety of my patient." Pemberton looked from Sterling's indignant face to Sarah's calm one. He was a man who cared about one thing above all else: liability. And a decorated surgeon, son of a senator, was a much smaller liability than an aging nurse with a tremor and a history of, as Sterling had put it, instability. The decision had already been made. "Sarah," Pemberton said, his voice slick with false sympathy, "given the severity of these allegations and your short tenure here, the board feels it's in the hospital's best interest to terminate your employment, effective immediately." He slid a piece of paper across the table. Sarah did not look at it. She just nodded slowly. "Fine," she said. She stood up. There was no begging, no pleading, no crying. Just a quiet, dignified acceptance that stunned the men in the room into silence. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at Sterling. "When you check on him later," she asked, her voice soft, "will you tell him you were the one who saved him?" The question was a dagger, and it found its mark. A flicker of shame crossed Sterling's face before it was replaced by his customary arrogance. Big Mike Sullivan, the kind-faced security guard who had worked the night shift for 30 years, was waiting for her outside the office. He held an empty cardboard box. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled, his eyes full of pity. "This isn't right." "Watch that blood pressure, Mike," she said, giving him a small, sad smile. The walk back to the nurses' station was a walk of shame. Heads turned, and then quickly turned away. Whispers followed her down the hall. No one would meet her eyes. They knew the injustice of it, but they also knew the price of speaking up. She packed her few belongings into the box. A cracked coffee mug that said, "World's okayest nurse." her worn stethoscope, a small, dying succulent plant, and a framed photo of her late husband, smiling, handsome in his army dress uniform. 2 decades of a life reduced to a cardboard box that would not even fill the passenger seat of a car. Big Mike escorted her to the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open, revealing the cold, miserable Chicago night. The rain was coming down harder now, a relentless, icy drizzle. "You take care of yourself," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, clutching the box to her chest, trying to shield the photo from the rain. The doors slid shut behind her with a final, indifferent whoosh. It was over. The thought was not angry or sad. It was just a heavy, suffocating fact. She had traded her career for a man's life, and in the cold calculus of the world, it seemed she had made a bad deal. Her car was in the shop, a repair she could not afford. So she started the long walk to the bus stop 6 blocks away. The rain plastered her thin scrubs to her skin, soaking her to the bone. The weight of the box grew heavier with each step. She huddled under the flimsy shelter of the bus stop, shivering, watching the traffic hiss by on the wet pavement. She saw her reflection in the dark glass of the shelter. A tired, old woman, drenched and defeated. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe she was just a relic, a stubborn old nurse who did not know her place. She would lose her certification. He would press charges. She would end up greeting customers at a grocery store, another forgotten face with a story no one would ever know. And then she heard it again. That same sound from before. A low thrumming that vibrated up through the soles of her shoes. Thwop, thwop, thwop. She looked up, past the glowing streetlights and the rainy sky. At first, she saw nothing. Then, the low-hanging clouds tore apart, ripped open by 3 piercingly bright searchlights. Descending from the heavens were 2 Black Hawk helicopters, their olive-drab fuselages sleek and menacing against the dark clouds. They were not heading for the hospital's rooftop helipad. They were coming for the street. Pedestrians scattered, screaming, assuming it was a terrorist attack. Cars slammed on their brakes, tires screeching, causing a multi-car pileup. The downdraft from the rotors hit the street like a physical blow, inverting umbrellas, sending trash cans rolling, and whipping the rain into a horizontal tempest. One of the Black Hawks landed with impossible precision in the middle of the intersection, its massive blades clearing the traffic lights by mere inches. The other hovered protectively above it. Simultaneously, a symphony of sirens erupted from all directions. Black SUVs with government plates came screaming down the street from both ends, positioning themselves sideways to block all traffic. The street was instantly locked down, washed in a blinding bath of red, blue, and white flashing lights. The side door of the landed helicopter slid open. Men in black tactical gear, not soldiers but something more elite, rappelled to the ground, establishing a secure perimeter with an unnerving, silent efficiency. One of them pointed, not at the hospital but directly at the bus stop. Directly at her. "Target acquired," a voice crackled over a hidden radio. From one of the black SUVs, a door opened. An old man emerged, moving with a purpose that belied his age. He did not run from the rain. He walked through it as if it did not dare touch him. He leaned on a simple wooden cane, but he did not use it for support. He wielded it like a scepter. On the shoulders of his immaculate dress uniform, 4 silver stars gleamed in the chaotic wash of emergency lights. A colorful mosaic of ribbons on his chest told the story of America's wars for the past half-century. He walked past the stunned police officers, past the scrambling hospital security, and stopped at the edge of the police tape, his eyes scanning the scene. His gaze swept over the hospital entrance and then settled on the drenched figure huddled at the bus stop. A flicker of recognition, then a grim tightening of his jaw. "General Callahan," an aide said, rushing to his side with an umbrella. The general waved him away without looking. "Find her," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that carried easily over the roar of the helicopter. "Bring her to me, now." One of the elite operators sprinted through the gridlocked traffic, dodging cars, his boots splashing through the deep puddles. He stopped in front of Sarah, his face a mixture of urgency and profound respect.
"Ma'am," he said, his voice breathless. "Lieutenant Colonel Miller, you need to come with us, now."
Sarah stared at him, bewildered, clutching her soggy cardboard box. There must be a mistake," she stammered. "No mistake, Mom," he said, his eyes pleading. He reached out and took her arm with a firm but gentle grip. "Drop the box. We're going." "No," she said, her voice small but stubborn, a flash of the old Sarah returning. "The box comes too." Section. Inside the hospital, chaos reigned. Dr. Preston Sterling was in the lobby, giving an impromptu press conference to the news crews that had materialized out of thin air. He had already spun his narrative. He was the hero who had saved the life of a decorated military officer, battling not only the man's horrific injuries, but also the interference of an unstable and incompetent nurse. And while the situation was critical, Sterling was saying, his face a mask of handsome sincerity for the cameras, "Our team at Metropolitan, following my direct leadership, was able to stabilize the patient. It was a textbook case of managing a multi-system trauma." He was interrupted by the sudden appearance of General Thomas Callahan, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, flanked by two stone-faced men in dark suits. He walked right through the press scrum, which parted before him like the Red Sea. He was followed by the operator, who was gently guiding a soaked and shivering Sarah Miller, still clutching her box. Sterling's heroic monologue died in his throat. His jaw went slack. Pemberton, who had been standing beside Sterling, beaming proudly, turned a shade of white that matched the hospital walls. General Callahan stopped directly in front of Sterling. He was a foot shorter than the surgeon, but his presence filled the entire lobby. The air crackled with an authority that Sterling, for all his inherited power, could not even comprehend. "Dr. Sterling," the general said, his voice deceptively calm, "I was just watching your press conference on the way over. Fascinating." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You just told the nation that you saved Commander Jacob Thorne's life. And you also told your administration that this woman," he gestured to Sarah with his cane, "was fired for incompetence and instability." That is correct, General," Sterling stammered, trying to regain his footing. "She was a danger to the patient. I had to have her removed." The general's eyes, the color of chips of ice, narrowed. "That's interesting," he said softly, "because I've spent the last hour reviewing the unedited security footage from your trauma bay, the telemetry data from the commander's monitors, and a preliminary statement from the commander himself." He turned to one of the men in suits, who handed him a sleek black folder with the Department of Defense seal embossed on it. The general opened it. He did not look at it as he spoke. He looked directly at Sterling. "Do you know who Sarah Miller is, Doctor?" Sterling shook his head, confused. "She was a nurse, an old, incompetent nurse." "She is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller, retired, United States Army Medical Corps," the general stated, his voice ringing with power. 7 tours of duty, 3 in Iraq, 4 in Afghanistan. She was the lead trauma specialist attached to a Joint Special Operations Command task force for 6 years. The people in that unit, the most elite soldiers in the world, they have a name for her. The general's eyes found Sarah's. For the first time, a flicker of warmth entered them. "They call her Dusty, because she was the one you wanted by your side when everything turned to dust." He looked back at Sterling, his face hard as stone again. "She is the recipient of the Silver Star, for running through enemy fire to perform a field cricothyrotomy on a wounded ranger. She has a Bronze Star with Valor for holding manual pressure on a soldier's severed femoral artery for 6 straight hours in a downed helicopter, while refusing evacuation for herself. That, by the way, is the source of the tremor in her hands. Nerve damage. A souvenir from saving a man's life. A collective gasp went through the assembled crowd of reporters and staff. Brittany Moore began to openly weep. Big Mike, standing by the door, slowly straightened up, a look of fierce pride on his face. The footage shows Commander Thorne going into cardiac arrest because of a tension pneumothorax. The general continued, his voice like the crack of a whip. A condition a first-year combat medic in a muddy ditch would have spotted in 30 seconds. The footage shows you focusing on a superficial neck wound while he was dying. It shows you freezing. And it shows Lieutenant Colonel Miller trying to warn you. When you failed to act, it shows her saving his life. And then it shows you physically assaulting her. The veneer on Preston Sterling finally shattered. The handsome, confident surgeon crumpled, his face draining of all color. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. This is absurd, he stammered, his voice cracking. I am the chief of surgery. My father is Senator Sterling. Your father is on the phone with the Secretary of Defense as we speak, the general said coldly, explaining why his son, a man who has never seen a day of conflict in his life, felt he was qualified to fire a decorated American hero for doing her job. He turned his withering gaze on the administrator, Harold Pemberton. And you sanctioned this. Pemberton began to babble, wiping his face with a handkerchief. General, I assure you, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. If we had known her background, we will rectify this immediately. She can have her job back, of course. Any position she wants. Director of nursing, a raise, anything. The general looked at Pemberton with utter contempt. Then he looked at Sarah, his expression softening again. Dusty, he said, his voice gentle. You look like hell. You're not so bad yourself, Tom, she replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. It was the first time anyone at the hospital had seen her smile. The general turned back to the administrator. Lieutenant Colonel Miller will not be returning to your employ, he said, his voice final. As of 10 minutes ago, she has been reactivated by presidential order to a civilian advisory role. She will be overseeing the complete overhaul of trauma protocols for all special operations medical personnel. Her first recommendation, he added, a grim smile playing on his lips, is that we no longer send our wounded warriors to this hospital. Pemberton looked like he was going to be sick. The loss of the lucrative military contract would cripple the hospital financially. As for you, Dr. Sterling, the general said, turning for the final blow, federal agents are on their way to your office. It seems that in our review of your performance, we uncovered a rather interesting pattern of billing fraud and malpractice cover-ups going back almost a decade. It turns out, when you lie to a federal officer about the medical treatment of another federal officer, it triggers a rather thorough investigation. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You are suspended, pending revocation of your medical license. You will be facing criminal charges, and your father's connections will not help you where you are going. Sterling stood there, mute, broken. The golden boy had melted. The general turned to leave, then paused. He looked at the soggy cardboard box in Sarah's hands. With infinite gentleness, he took it from her and handed it to his aide. Then he turned to Big Mike Sullivan, who had been watching the entire exchange with a look of pure, unadulterated joy. Son, the general said to the 60-year-old security guard, do you have another one of those boxes? Big Mike's face split into a wide grin. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a fresh, empty cardboard box. He walked right past the stunned reporters and held it out to the former chief of surgery. "I believe you know the way out, Dr. Sterling," Big Mike said, his voice ringing with the satisfaction of a justice long overdue. "Here's a box for your things. It's a bit small, but I think you'll manage." And that is how Sarah Dusty Miller went from fired and humiliated to a national hero in less than an hour. The story of Sarah Miller is a reminder that true heroism often goes unnoticed until the moment it becomes absolutely necessary. In a world obsessed with titles, status, and bureaucracy, it's easy to forget that the most important people in the room are often the ones doing the actual work. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible stories of justice. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded. Never judge a book by its cover, and never, ever underestimate a nurse. Comment below with your thoughts on Dr. Sterling's fate. Thanks for watching.